All right, so good morning, good afternoon, and good night, everyone. Welcome to our first Law Science event. I'm Simon Sun, the co-founder of Law Science. Law Science is an academic initiative coordinated by a group of SJD candidates who share the same belief in legal methodologies. Legal studies have been generally understood as a discipline outside of science, traditionally consisting of doctrinal analysis and debates on normative questions. However, we believe it can be improved by and benefit from scientific methodologies that provide systematic ways to approach questions and deliver falsifiable claims. If you want to learn more about the Law Science Project, please visit our website, www.lawscience.org, and you can join our email list. To that end, I want to introduce our coordinators today. We have Vanessa Villanueva-Kalau, who is an SJD candidate from University of Illinois College of Law.
Very nice to meet you all.
Yeah, and Patrick Huang Zongjia, who is a JST candidate from the law school at the University of Chicago.
Hi, everybody.
And Daniel Hoffek, who is a JST candidate from Cornell Law School.
Hello, everybody.
I also want to introduce Kathy Kim, who is an SJD candidate and the coordinator at the Merritt School of Law Graduate Colloquium.
Hello, everyone.
Yes. The Graduate Colloquium at Indiana University, Merritt School of Law is where doctoral candidates at Merritt School of Law find their niche. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Matthew Adler with us to start our first event for Law Science Fall 2022. Professor Matthew Adler is the Richard A. Horvitz Professor of Law and Professor of Economics, Philosophy, and Public Policy at Duke University, and is the founding director of the Duke Center for Law, Economics, and Public Policy. His scholarship is interdisciplinary, drawing from welfare, economics, normative ethics, and legal theory. Professor Adler is the author of numerous articles and several monographs, including New Foundation of Cost-Benefit Analysis, Well-Being and Fair Distribution, Beyond Cost-Benefit Analysis, and Measuring Social Welfare, and Introduction. He edited the Oxford Handbook of Wellbeing and Public Policy and is the co-founder of the Prioritarianism in Practice Research Network, whose work appears in an edited volume, Prioritarianism in Practice, published by Cambridge University Press 2022. Professor Adler has a Bachelor of Arts and JD from Yale University. He also received a Master of Letters degree in Modern History from St. Antony's College at Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar. He clerked for Judge Harry Edwards of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in 1991 to 1992, and for U.S. Supreme Justice Sandra Day O'Connor during the 1992 to 1993 term. Today, Professor Adler's speech is about measuring social welfare with priority for the worse off. We will have time for Q&A, so please prepare your questions. The event will be recorded and uploaded, so you can either raise your hand and open up your camera or type it down in the chat box, and I will read them for you. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor Adler.
Well, thank you so much, Simon and the other organizers for inviting me to this event. I'm really honored. Okay, so let me share my screen. Let's see. Trying to get to the slideshow mode here. There we go. Can you guys see that? Yep. Okay. So I'm going to talk about measuring social welfare with priority for the worse off, based on this book, Measuring Social Welfare, that appeared a couple years ago. Okay, so I've been researching cost-benefit analysis, CBA, and an important alternative, the social welfare function SWF framework, for a long time. and this book, Measuring Social Welfare, fits into that research agenda. CBA, as I'm sure people on this call know, is a dominant policy analysis tool. It's used in governmental practice in the UK, the US, and a number of other countries, and in much academic work. And what CBA does is to measure well-being effects in money, that is dollars, euros, pounds, or some other currency, and then sum up more precisely for different people in the population. If we consider some policy intervention relative to the status quo, for each person, we can think about all the different ways in which the policy might affect her well-being. We can measure that overall effect with a monetary equivalent. So if she is better off with the policy as compared to the status quo, she has a positive monetary equivalent, which is simply her willingness to pay for the policy. If she is worse off with the policy than the status quo, she has a negative monetary equivalent, which is simply a -1 times her willingness to accept for the policy. And then CBA assigns the policy an overall value, which is simply the sum total of monetary equivalents. And so if the policy has a positive sum total of monetary equivalents, it's seen as being better than the status quo, and the best policy is the one with the largest sum of monetary equivalents. All right, so why have we ended up with this money metric-based policy analysis tool? Well, the story really goes back to the 1930s. So a widespread view in economics since the 1930s is that interpersonal well-being comparisons are impossible, or at least unnecessary for economics. It's either impossible or at least unnecessary to compare the well-being of one person to the well-being of someone else. CBA becomes influential in that milieu. CBA doesn't require interpersonal comparisons, right? All we need to know to calculate a given person's monetary equivalent is what her preferences are, right? Knowing her preferences, we can calculate her willingness to accept, willingness to pay for different policies. We don't need to make any kinds of comparisons between the preferences of one person and the preferences of someone else. And so again, if you're skeptical about interpersonal comparisons, then CBA begins to look attractive. One still has to wonder, well, so why is CBA defensible, right? Given that we can measure well-being effects in money using these monetary equivalents, right? Why is the CBA test, which simply sums up these monetary equivalents, a good way to think about policies? Well, the standard story is in terms of so-called Cowder-Hicks efficiency, Cowder and Hicks being British economists from the 1930s, otherwise known as potential Pareto superiority. If the monetary equivalents of the winners, those who are better off with the policy as compared to the status quo, are larger in magnitude than the total monetary equivalents of the losers, those who are worse off with the policy as compared to the status quo, there is in principle a transfer of money from the winners to the losers that makes everyone better off. So in this book, New Foundations of Cost-Benefit Analysis, which Simon kindly mentioned, that I wrote with Eric Posner in 2006, we made a bunch of arguments. First, we argued that the Cowder-Hicks defense of CBA is unpersuasive. Right? The Cowder-Hicks defense says if a policy passes the cost-benefit test, then in theory, there is a scheme of transfers from winners to losers such that everyone is better off. But often, policies that are picked up by CBA are not accompanied by any such transfers, right? So the losers remain worse off with the policy as compared to the status quo. Right, and so it's hard to see that the sheer possibility of a scheme of compensating transfers, is a persuasive argument in favor of the policy. The second point we make is that interpersonal comparisons are possible. I mean, interpersonal comparisons of the well-being of different persons are, made all the time in ordinary discourse. They're generally accepted by philosophers or philosophers working in the utilitarian tradition for hundreds of years have accepted interpersonal comparisons. And so it seems like economists' resistance to interpersonal comparisons is just, a kind of indefensible dogma. And so we said, rather than thinking of CBA, as a way to implement Cowder-Hicks efficiency, we can instead see CBA as a rough proxy for overall well-being, right? The fact that a policy passes the CBA test relative to the status quo is a rough indicator that the policy increases overall well-being relative to the status quo. Well, why is CBA only a rough proxy for overall well-being? The answer has to do with the so-called diminishing marginal utility of income. I think many people on this call may have heard of that. The idea of diminishing marginal utility is that income has a smaller and smaller effect on well-being as people become richer, right? So adding, $100 to the income of someone earning $10,000 makes a bigger change to her well-being than adding $100 to the income of someone earning $100,000. And for this reason, CBA, which sums up money, can only be seen as a rough proxy for overall well-being. Okay, so this is the backstory to what I've been doing for the last, 15 plus years, which is thinking about the social welfare function framework. Right? Why be content with a rough proxy for overall well-being? Why not see if we can sort of more accurately implement overall well-being? And for that matter, why limit ourselves to evaluating policies in terms of overall well-being? What if we're also concerned about the distribution of well-being? So those thoughts got me going in terms of this social welfare function framework. So this framework, I certainly did not make this up. I've just done a lot of work sort of fleshing out the philosophical details and thinking about applications, but the framework itself originates in theoretical welfare economics, and it's now well accepted in some applied literatures within economics, in particular optimal tax theory and climate economics. It's not, at least yet, used by governments. So the framework conceptualizes a given governmental policy as a probability distribution, a lottery over possible outcomes, where each outcome is a possible social consequence of policy choice. And again, by policy, this is anything the government might do, right? It might be enacting a regulation, it might be building infrastructure, it might be distributing a vaccine, it might be, licensing a pharmaceutical, literally anything the government might do in its desire to, improve people's lives. So we can think of an outcome as a lottery over, we can think of a policy as a lottery over outcomes. Again, an outcome is a possible social consequence of policy choice. It describes what might happen to everyone in the population of interest, right? What might happen in terms of all of each person's different welfare relevant attributes, up to the limits of modeling tractability. So for example, an outcome might describe a possible longevity, a lifespan for each person, health states over that lifespan, income amounts over that lifespan, and so forth. Okay, so we start by thinking of policies as lotteries over outcomes, and then the SWF framework, has three key components to end up with a mathematical representation of a policy. So the first component of the framework is an interpersonally comparable well-being measure W, right, which converts an outcome into a list, what mathematicians call a vector of well-being numbers. I'm assuming here a fixed population of n people. So a given outcome X becomes the list or vector W1X through WNX, right? So there are n well-being numbers with W1X meaning the well-being a number of individual one in outcome X, right? A numerical summary of her well-being in outcome X. So we have a well-being measure that converts an outcome into a vector of well-being numbers. We then have the SWF proper, which is a rule for ranking well-being vectors. Now, there are many different SWFs, right? So the utilitarian SWF simply adds up well-being numbers, right? Each vector is assigned a number equaling the sum total of well-being in that vector. A prioritarian social welfare function adds up well-being numbers plugged into a concave transformation function G so as to give more weight to well-being changes affecting those at lower levels of well-being priority. And I'll give a picture that illustrates that in a second. And then having adopted a given social welfare function, whether utilitarian, prioritarian, or something else, we need to specify an uncertainty module which specifies how the social welfare function should be applied to policies. Again, lotteries over outcomes, but with our well-being measure in hand, policies are now seen as lotteries over well-being vectors. Okay, so now this shows a prioritarian social welfare function. Prioritarianism, rather than simply summing up well-being numbers, sums up well-being numbers plugged into a concave transformation function, this G function, right? It's concave, meaning that it bends over. It's not a straight line. It sort of bends over, as illustrated in this figure. Mathematically, that means the slope gets smaller and smaller as the input values get larger. The effect of concavity, what concavity does is to operationalize this idea of giving priority to the worse off. Now, let me say in my book, Measuring Social Welfare, if you do look at it, I refer to this type of social welfare function as a continuous prioritarian social welfare function. But in this talk and these slides, I'm just going to refer to it more simply as a prioritarian social welfare function. It's the formal expression of the ethical view prioritarianism developed by the great philosopher Derek Parfit about 30 years ago or so. Now, so what happens here? By virtue of concavity, imagine that we have two people. One person is worse off in terms of well-being. That person is at well-being level W sub L. If you look at the x-axis, the horizontal axis, that's to the left on the x-axis, W sub L. And a second person at a higher level of well-being, at well-being level W sub H. And we think about increasing the well-being of each person by a quantum delta W. So we delta W is the same amount, so we can take the worse off person and move her from her well-being level to that level plus delta W, and the same for the better off person. And what happens is that the change in transformed well-being that occurs by increasing the individual's well-being by delta W is bigger for the worse off person than the better off person. That's simply an implication of concavity, and you can see that on the y-axis, right? The worse off individual experiences a bigger increase in G values than the better off person does. And so this shows how concavity, right, plugging well-being numbers into this concave transformation function is a way to operationalize the philosophical idea of prioritarianism. One other thing to say is that, unlike utilitarianism, which is a single social welfare function, simply summing up well-being, prioritarianism is an entire family of social welfare functions, right? All social welfare functions that take the form of summing transformed well-being using a concave transformation function. And of course, there are many different such functions. There are many different specific versions of prioritarianism. Okay, so in my work on social welfare functions, and Simon kindly mentioned this in his nice introduction, I've written a bunch of things. The pictures are on the right there. I've really tried to do three things. First, I've tried to develop the underlying normative theory of social welfare functions in general, and specifically of prioritarian social welfare functions, here integrating the economic literature with philosophical scholarship on utilitarianism, prioritarianism, etc. The second thing I've tried to do is to illustrate the application of social welfare functions, especially prioritarian social welfare functions, to various policy domains, such as fatality risk regulation and climate policy. And finally, I've tried to present the social welfare function in an accessible manner so that it's more widely understood and seen as a viable competitor to CBA. And as Simon mentioned, the most recent book here, this book, Prioritarianism Practice, which I edited with Ole Norheim, we were privileged to work with a terrific team of economists and policy analysts and health scholars, and different chapters in that book, sort of showcase the application of both prioritarian and utilitarian social welfare functions by contrast with cost-benefit analysis or other traditional techniques in a whole range of different policy areas. Okay, this just simply shows measuring social welfare, which again is meant to present these ideas in an accessible way. If you do look at the book, there is a mathematical appendix which fleshes things out more rigorously, but the text is meant to be more accessible. Okay, so let me just say a little bit more about social welfare functions, the well-being measure, the uncertainty module, and then I'll move to an example to show how this all plays out and to illustrate the differences between utilitarianism and prioritarianism, as well as the differences between both of them and cost-benefit analysis. Right. So one thing, one way to think about, again, there are many different social welfare functions, right? Many different possible rules for ranking these well-being vectors. How should we choose among them? Well, one way to do that, this is a methodology that the theoretical literature on SWFs uses, is to think in terms of axioms, right? Axioms are constraints on the ranking of well-being vectors. And by thinking about which such constraints, you like, that is, which such constraints you might want to endorse as an ethical matter, that's going to help narrow down the functional form of the social welfare function. So these are axioms. I'm assuming here a 4-person population, right? So, within the various parentheses on the screen here, we have 4 numbers. These are, the well-being vectors of the 4 people, individual 1, 2, 3, and 4, with different well-being numbers. So, for example, after strong Pareto, that first vector has 3, 4, 10, 13. These are well-being numbers. This indicates that in that vector, individual 1 is at well-being level 3, individual 2 at well-being level 4, individual 3 at well-being level 10, individual 4 at well-being level 13. So I'm not going to talk about the axioms mathematically. I'm just going to say what they mean in words. But strong Pareto says if we make one person better off, at least one person better off and no one worse off, at least one person better off and no one worse off, that's an ethical improvement. Anonymity or impartiality says if we simply permute or rearrange the well-being numbers, that makes no ethical difference, right? That is, we keep in place the same general pattern. We simply change which particular person is at which well-being level. That itself makes no difference, right? This expresses the ethical attitude of impartiality. We care about the pattern of well-being, not about which particular person is at which well-being level. P. Dalton says if you imagine a pure transfer of well-being from someone better off to someone worse off, that affects no one else, right? So one person to another person affecting no one else. And this pure transfer of well-being from someone better off to someone worse off shrinks the well-being gap between them. That's an ethical improvement. Separability says if some people are unaffected, if those people are at the same well-being levels in 2 vectors, then the ranking of vectors should not depend on what specifically those well-being levels are, right? So separability says that in ranking well-being vectors, we can focus on the affected people, right? Those people whose well-being does change as between the 2 vectors. And then finally, continuity says that if one well-being vector is better than a second, that's also true for a sufficiently small region around the first vector. Now, a couple of things, so P.Q. Dalton, the sort of equity axiom, it's equity in well-being space, is the axiom that differentiates utilitarianism and prioritarianism. So it's not too hard to see that prioritarianism satisfies all 5 of these axioms. If you rank well-being vectors by plugging them in to this concave transformation function, plugging in well-being numbers and summing them up. That's going to satisfy all five. Utilitarianism is going to satisfy strong Pareto anonymity, separability, and continuity, but not Pigou-Dalton. So Pigou-Dalton is the axiom that differentiates utilitarianism and prioritarianism. The other thing, which is kind of amazing, it's not hard to see, again, that if you're prioritarian, you're going to satisfy all five axioms. What's more interesting is that the converse is also true, right? If you start by saying, gee, I like all five of these axioms, right? I want a rule for ranking well-being vectors that satisfies all five axioms, then you must be prioritarian, right? Prioritarianism is the only social welfare function that satisfies all five axioms. And by committing yourself to all five, you end up with prioritarianism. And so, a lot of my argumentation for prioritarianism has been about these axioms. This is a table from the book that shows, let me say the first two axioms, Pareto and anonymity, are not very controversial. What's more controversial is, the last three, Pigou-Dalton, separability, and continuity, and what this table from Measuring Social Welfare shows is how we can use those three axioms to carve up the space of social welfare functions. Okay, so this shows why social welfare functions need interpersonally comparable well-being numbers. Again, that is just a feature of the approach. If you don't like interpersonal comparisons, then you can't use social welfare functions. Let's imagine we have, two people, G and Keith, and three outcomes, X, Y, and Z. And we assign those individuals well-being numbers and the outcomes using the numbers, on the left of this table, right? So Gia's well-being numbers are 49, 64, 36 for the three outcomes, and Keith's are 16, 9, and 25. Now, on the right, what we've done is to take the well-being numbers on the left and multiply those numbers by an individual specific constant. Right, so Gia's numbers are multiplied by 1/10, right? So instead of 49, 64, 36, on the right, we now have 4.9, 6.4, and 3.6. And Keith's numbers are just multiplied by 1. So note that all of the intrapersonal, right, all of the within-person well-being information contained in the well-being numbers on the left is preserved by the well-being numbers on the right, right? So intrapersonal comparisons of well-being levels, differences, and for that matter, ratios are the same on the right as on the left. So for example, according to the well-being numbers on the left, Gia is better off in Y than in X and better off in X than in Z, right? 64 is bigger than 49, is bigger than 36. And the same is true on the right, right? The numbers on the right, again, say that Gia is better off in Y than in X and in X than in Z, right? 6.4 is bigger than 4.9, is bigger than 3.6. What changes as between the well-being numbers on the left and the well-being numbers on the right is the interpersonal, the across-person well-being information. So for example, according to the well-being numbers on the left, Gia in Y is better off than Keith in Y. According to the well-being numbers on the right, Gia in Y is worse off than Keith in Y. So if you don't believe in interpersonal well-being comparisons, if you believe that's nonsense or unnecessary, then you should be equally happy with the well-being numbers on the left and the well-being numbers on the right, because they contain the very same within-person well-being information. But what happens if we now use these numbers and plug them into a social welfare function, such as utilitarianism, prioritarianism, or any other plausible social welfare function? The ranking of the outcomes changes. So for example, if you look at the second to the bottom row there, utilitarianism, if we take the well-being numbers on the left and plug them into the utilitarian role, right, we have that outcome Y is better than outcome X is better than outcome Z, right? 73 bigger than 65, bigger than 61. On the other hand, if we take the numbers on the right and plug them into the utilitarian social welfare function, right? We now have a different ranking of the outcomes, namely that outcome Z is the best, better than X, better than Y, because 28.6 is bigger than 20.9, is bigger than 15.4. So, and again, that happens with any plausible social welfare function. So the lesson of this is that social welfare functions need interpersonal information, right? If we think that our well-being numbers simply contain interpersonal well-being information, then we're not going to be able to end up with a stable ranking of outcomes using social welfare functions. All right, so this is just a way to show why this whole framework requires interpersonal comparisons. How are we going to come up with an interpersonally comparable well-being number? The approach that I sketch out, in the book, in my chapter, in the handbook of well-being and public policy, and elsewhere, is by constructing an interpersonally comparable well-being measure using so-called V&M, von Neumann-Morgenstern utility functions. As those of you who've taken some economics may well know, this idea of a V&M utility function is a common thing in economics. Basically, utility function is a mathematical device that represents people's risk preferences. People with different risk preferences have different utility functions. And the approach that I take, is to take the various V&M utility functions representing different people's risk preferences and then rescale them. And that way, we're going to end up with a well-being measure which is interpersonally comparable, and by the way, also respects preferences. Now, again, let me say, economists generally think of well-being in terms of preferences, but the social welfare function framework itself is also fully compatible with a well-being measure that's based upon a hedonic or an objective good account of well-being. All right, so let me just say one thing to argue for prioritarianism, and then I want to move on to one more thing, and then quickly move on to the actual example. So the social welfare function framework is a formal expression of what ethicists call welfare consequentialism, right? This is an approach to ethical reasoning that grounds ethical guidance with respect to a given choice. So, for example, a governmental policy choice in the possible consequences of that choice, its possible outcomes, and moreover sees the ethical ranking of outcomes as grounded in individuals' well-being. Now, it seems to me that for welfare consequentialists, the strong Pareto and anonymity axiom should seem compelling. And indeed, those axioms are universally accepted by welfare economists and indeed by ethicists in the welfare tradition. What about Pigou-Dalton? Well, what I've tried to do in my work is to put forward an ethical case for Pigou-Dalton using the concept of claims. Again, remember, Pigou-Dalton says that a pure transfer of well-being from a better off person to a worse off person that reduces the gap between them and with everyone else unaffected is an ethical improvement. So, for example, imagine that an outcome X, Alan is at 50, these are well-being numbers, and Brienne at 30. We transfer 12 units so that an outcome Y, Alan is at 38, and Brienne's at 42, and no one else is affected. So Alan has a claim in favor of X over Y, right? He has a claim to be at 50 rather than 38. While Brienne has a claim in favor of Y over X, namely she's a claim to be at 42 rather than 30. So it seems, now again, this is an ethical argument. This is not a scientific argument or a purely a natural argument, but it is an ethical argument. It seems very plausible that Brienne's claim is stronger than Alan's, right? Note that each individual, both individuals experience the same well-being difference, right? Alan wants to go from 38 to 50. Brienne wants to go from 30 to 42, right? So they each want to move up by 12 units. But in addition, Brienne starts from a lower level, right? She starts from 30 as opposed to 38. Surely well-being level should have some effect on the strength of claims. Even if they have a small effect, a minimal effect, then it seems that Brienne has a stronger claim. Again, it's a kind of argument to flesh out why Pigou-Dalton, that is equity and well-being space, is ethically plausible. And then finally, separability and continuity have large advantages in terms of tractability. And again, utilitarianism satisfies those. as well as the first two. It's really Pigou Dalton that differentiates utilitarianism from prioritarianism. Choosing a prioritarian social welfare function, of course, we have a whole family. Within that family, it's possible to provide an axiomatic argument for a subfamily of prioritarian social welfare functions, so-called Atkinson social welfare functions, which take the following form. They're kind of a power function. They're calibrated by this gamma parameter. With gamma 0, the Atkinson social welfare function is utilitarian, and as gamma gets bigger and bigger, this social welfare function gives more and more priority to the worse off, right? That concave transformation becomes more and more bent over, in effect. By choosing a specific level of gamma, and we can do that through thought experiments, we end up with a specific prioritarian social welfare function. Let me just say something about this. The final part, again, the framework in general, as I said, has three components: the well-being measure. Again, my approach is to measure well-being based upon rescaled V&M utility functions. Second, the social welfare function itself. I've talked about how one might choose between different such functions axiomatically. And then for a given social welfare function, we need what I call an uncertainty module, right? This is a rule for ranking policies understood as probability distributions over outcomes. The standard module for utilitarianism is ESWB, which is the abbreviation I use in the book, the expected sum of well-being, right? Each vector, we sum up well-being, that's the utilitarian rule. A policy that now is a lottery over vectors, and so we assign a number to a policy as the expected sum of well-being. Prioritarianism, there are a bunch of different approaches that are defended in the literature in terms of applying a given prioritarian social welfare function under uncertainty. The one that I think is best justified is the expected sum of transformed well-being, sometimes called ex post prioritarianism. ESTWB, that's the abbreviation that I use in the book, and I'm going to math formulas are at the bottom there, and I'm now going to talk about this policy example, comparing ESWB, this utilitarian module, to ESTWB, this prioritarian module, and in turn comparing both to cost-benefit analysis. Okay, so this is an example from chapter 5 of Measuring Social Welfare. It illustrates the application of utilitarianism, prioritarianism, and cost-benefit analysis to fatality risk reduction, which of course is a pervasive activity of governments, right? Many different types of governmental policies are intended in main, or at least substantially, to reduce individuals' fatality risks. So environmental pollution control, workplace safety policies, food safety policies, infrastructure design, policies that concern motor vehicle safety, and pandemic policy. Of course, we've experienced that recently with policies to abate the COVID pandemic. So what I do here, this is a model based upon the US survival curve, right? The survival curve says for a given individual as a function of her age and other characteristics, what is the probability of surviving the current year, the year after that, and so forth. That can be estimated based upon actual data. I also have data about the actual US income distribution. And so I construct a hypothetical population consisting of 25 cohorts. So individuals of 5 different ages, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60, and 5 different income amounts corresponding to the the lowest income, which corresponds to the 10th percentile of the US income distribution, 10th, 30th, 50th, 70th, and 90th percentiles. So crossing these two dimensions, we end up with 25 age income groups. And for each group, I can, from US data, estimate her baseline survival curve and the income that she earns in each year of life, conditional on being alive in that year. And I think about a hypothetical policy consisting of a uniform 1 in 100,000 risk reduction, right? So across all 25 cohorts, I reduce each individual's risk of dying in the current year by 1 in 100,000. Prior to COVID, that was seen as kind of a normal, sort of magnitude for a risk reduction policy. And then I asked, what is the break even in terms of reduced income? I mean, obviously, if we're putting in place a given policy and we can reduce everyone's risk by 1 in 100,000 with no loss in income, then of course we should do that, right? That's the benefit with no cost. On the other hand, if the cost is very high, if we can reduce everyone's risk of dying by 1 in 100,000 only at very high cost, then we're not going to want to do that. And so then we can ask, what is the break even? Right, the break even is the reduction in income such that if the actual reduction in income from the policy is below the break even, on balance, we say the policy is a good thing. If the actual reduction in income is above the break even, then on balance, we say the policy is a bad thing, right? And we can calculate this break even again for a uniform 100,000 risk reduction across the 25 cohorts, as calculated by CBA, utilitarianism, and prioritarianism. Here, I'm assuming this Atkinson prioritarian function with gamma 2, so that's kind of a moderate degree of priority for the worse off. And I calculate that with two different assumptions about the incidence of costs, right? So uniform cost incidence means that when we put in place the policy, the income, the lost income is the same in absolute terms across 25 cohorts, right? Everyone incurs the very same reduction in income. Proportional incidence says the loss in income is the same proportion of income across the 25 cohorts, right? Everyone suffers the same fractional reduction in income, but that means in absolute terms that individuals with higher income incur a larger reduction. And then I calculate the break evens. Now, a couple of things just leap out from this chart. One is that the break evens are different. So first of all, I mean, if you look at uniform cost incidence, right, the utilitarian break even, which is 48, is lower than cost benefit analysis in this case, right? Utilitarians are willing to spend less for this risk reduction than cost benefit analysis. I mean, this illustrates, among other things, that at least in this case, utilitarianism is, the cost benefit is a poor proxy for utilitarianism. The break evens are quite different. And then prioritarianism is different from both. In this case, prioritarianism ends up being sort of in between utilitarianism and CBA at 78. The other thing is that if we shift from uniform cost incidence, so it's the very same risk reduction, but we change the incidence of costs from being a uniform incidence to a proportional incidence, the CBA break even does not change, right? In both cases, CBA is willing to spend up to 91 per person to avoid this 100,000 risk. But CBA doesn't care whether the incomes are income cost is distributed uniformly or proportionally. By contrast, utilitarianism, prioritarianism, in both cases, the break evens increase, right? As the income costs are shifted, in effect, from the poor to the rich, both utilitarianism and even more so prioritarianism are willing to incur greater costs. So let me just, I'm going to end with this slide because I do want to have some time for questions. But what I do in the chapter and what I'll illustrate here is sort of give greater insight into what's driving the different ways in which CBA, utilitarianism, and prioritarianism assess these reduction policies. So what the tables show is the value of a risk reduction, specifically the value, the social value of a 1 in 100,000 risk reduction to the various individuals. Social value as calculated by each methodology, right? So in the table at the top here, labeled CBA, these 25 numbers represent the CBA value of a 1 in 100,000 risk reduction. In the utilitarian table, the numbers represent the utilitarian value of a 1 in 100,000 risk reduction to the different individuals. And finally, prioritarianism at the bottom right, the numbers represent the prioritarian value of a 1 in 100,000 risk reduction. CBA value is the value in terms of the sum of monetary equivalence. Utilitarian value is the value in terms of the expected sum of well-being. Prioritarian value is the value in terms of the expected sum of transformed well-being, right? So different metric of social value, but for each metric, we can calculate the value of a risk reduction for each of the 25 different individuals. The numbers are normalized so that 1 is the value of the risk reduction to a 60-year-old low-income individual, right? You'll note that in the 3 tables, the number in the bottom left cell, the cell for 60 and low income, 10% low income, is 1. Okay, so what do the patterns of the numbers show? So for example, let's start with the utilitarian table, right? So if you look the bottom left table there, the utilitarian value for the risk reduction to the 60-year-old 10th percentile income person is 1. Moving all the way to the top of the column, you can see that the value for the risk reduction to the 20-year-old with the same income is 2.8. That means that utilitarianism sees a 1 in 100,000 risk reduction to a 20-year-old low-income person as having 2.8 times the value as the very same reduction for a 60-year-old, right? So these numbers here show relative values as per utilitarianism across the 25 cohorts, right? Or again, let's stick with the row for the 60-year-olds, right? If you move from the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile, the numbers go from 1.0 to 2.3. 2.3 now means that the very same risk reduction, a 1 in 100,000 risk reduction for a 60-year-old 90th percentile income person has 2.3 times the utilitarian value of that risk reduction for the poorest individual. Okay, so what you can see from these tables, looking at the utilitarian table, is that 2 patterns. First of all, as individuals get older, so within each column, holding constant income, as individuals get older, the numbers decrease. Utilitarianism prefers to allocate a given risk reduction to a younger person as compared to an older person. The reason for that basically is that the younger you are, life expectancy remaining, that is your life expectancy remaining conditional on surviving the current year, is larger, right? So a 20-year-old has, let's say, a life expectancy remaining of 65. A 60-year-old has a life expectancy remaining of maybe 27. And so the utilitarian sees more gain in saving a younger person as compared to an older person. That's why the numbers decrease within the columns. And then moving rightward in each row, the numbers increase. Utilitarianism, at a given age, utilitarianism sees a greater value in saving a richer as compared to a poorer person, a bigger increase in expected well-being, because money is good for welfare. CBA, if you look at the top table here, the CBA numbers, like the utilitarian numbers, decrease with age. The big difference is that CBA increases with income even more dramatically than utilitarianism, right? This is a huge difference, right? So if you look at the 6-year-old row, the CBA numbers go from 1.0 to 18.4, right? So the CBA value, the monetary equivalent for a risk reduction to a 60-year-old 90th percentile person is 18.4 times that of the CBA value of that risk reduction to the 10th percentile individual, while the utilitarian numbers increase only from 1.0 to 2.3. The reason for that, basically, as I explained in the book, is that CBA takes an increase in someone's expected well-being and then converts that into a monetary equivalent, right? It accomplishes that conversion by dividing by the marginal utility of income, and because marginal utility decreases, right? Because richer people have a lower marginal utility, right? If we divide by that, we end up with a bigger monetary equivalent. And so that's why CBA is more dramatically skewed to the rich than utilitarianism. Prioritarianism, finally, and I'll stop here, prioritarianism accentuates the utilitarian and CBA preference for the young, but it reverses, at least if gamma is big enough, it can reverse the utilitarian and CBA preference for the rich. That's because prioritarianism gives more weight to those who are worse off. And so if we reduce the risk of a 60-year-old, for example, low-income person as compared to a 60-year-old high-income person, although the risk reduction for the lower-income person produces a smaller increase in expected well-being, we give greater weight to that. And so, for example, in the 60-year-old row in the prioritarian table here, the numbers actually decrease as individuals become wealthier rather than increasing. Okay, I'm beyond 45 minutes, so let me stop there and then happy to take questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Adler. I'm very impressed. I demonstrate prioritarianism and utilitarianism gives greater weight to well-being changes affected by worse off individuals. So we have entered the Q&A session. Again, the event is going to be recorded and uploaded. So you can either raise your hand or write down your questions in the chat box, and I can read them for you. So are there any questions for Professor Adler? I can kick off with some of my my question on maybe the application part here. I'm a cyber law person, so I think about privacy, free speech, and cybersecurity and artificial intelligence quite often. And when I was reading your article, you talked about how this traditionally risk regulation is a policy domain where currently CBA operates as a major governmental assessment tool. And this connects to one of the major component of AI regulation, which is a lot of scholars use a risk as a way to kind of approach AI or just algorithmic harm. So my question here is, under your framework, how would the application differentiate, or how would we start, the analysis here when it comes to AI risk regulation?
Yeah, that's really interesting. No, so again, I mean, when I was talking about risk in that application, I'm interested in fatality risk, right? Because a lot of what existing policy programs, let's say in the U.S., or for example, the EPA or the FDA or the Department of Transportation and so forth, these are concerned substantially with reducing individuals' fatality risk, right? But yeah, the different types of risks. So in general, I mean, for any policy, ideally we can think of a policy. I mean, abstractly, we have, a policy is something the government might do, right? So you can think of there being a set of policies, including just the status quo. The status quo policy is just doing nothing new, right? And then each policy is converted into a lottery over outcomes. And so, formally we have a set of policies, but a set of outcomes, and a given policy corresponds to a lottery over outcomes. Outcomes are sort of models of, as I said, possible consequences of the population. So we're modeling well-being in terms of longevity, in terms of income, in terms of health and other things. And then we think about each policy as a lottery over these different outcomes. So, regulating AI in theory is not different. I mean, if we're concerned about AI, we're concerned about both the benefits of AI and the cost to well-being. And so we would then again try to think of policies as lotteries over outcomes. I mean, two complications. One is, if the effects of AI are big enough, that could actually change the size of the population, right? So if we're thinking about kind of the long-term effects of AI, we might think about the effects of that on the population. On the one hand, AI might be very beneficial, and so people can reproduce more and have good lives. On the other hand, if you think about kind of on the level in general AI, that could reduce the size of the population. So first, one needs to think about applying the social work function framework to the so-called variable population setup with different population sizes, and that's been done, and I actually write about that in the book. The other problem is just kind of the deep uncertainty. I mean, at this point, we're still really uncertain about what might happen as a result of AI, right? And so this idea that for any policy, we can assign it a precise lottery of outcomes, maybe that's unrealistic, right? And this, by the way, is not just true of AI, it's true of other types of policy. So for example, if you think about climate change, right? Maybe the effects of climate change are going to be catastrophic. Can we really assign precise probabilities to that? So again, that's going to push us maybe to broaden the framework. I don't know whether people here have heard of this notion of ambiguity, which means that we can't really capture our uncertainty with precise probabilities. Maybe we only have a range of probabilities. And again, the social work function framework can sort of generalize to that setup, but we're going to need maybe to think in those terms, to think in a sort of an inclusive way about, the risks and benefits of AI.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that response. Professor Gabrielle Goodwin wanted to send her regards. She had to leave early. She's the director of the Graduate Legal Studies.
Sure.
And we have a question from Jerry Pai, who is an SGD candidate. So he asked whether he wants to kind of ask for some clarification in terms of, does it mean it is better to distribute more resources to the poor than the rich, even if the rich can create more money by using them?
Well, okay, so let's start with the case of a fixed amount of resources, right? So utilitarianism says if you have a fixed amount of resources, I mean, given diminishing marginal utility, right? So even utilitarianism says that the well-being effect of a given quantum of resources is bigger for someone with lower income than for someone with higher income, right? So utilitarianism says if we have a fixed quantum of resources, we should transfer those from the rich to the poor. And indeed, if we transferred resources from the rich to the poor and we lost some resources, that might be okay, as long as the loss is not too great. Prioritarianism, gives priority to the worse off in terms of well-being, right? So prioritarianism, again, given a fixed amount of resources, is going to want to transfer income from the rich to the poor. If in the case of a pure transfer, and for that matter, in the case of a leaky transfer, right? Because even if we lose some resources, we may want to do the transfer. The difference is going to be that prioritarianism is going to tolerate, if we're thinking of an income transfer with a fixed pot of income, prioritarianism is going to tolerate more leakage than utilitarianism, right? Because we're giving more weight to the well-being of the worse off than the better off. Now, of course, though, policies don't do that. So, for example, if we put in place a tax policy, we increase taxes on the rich, that will mean that the rich are not, people are not going to work as much, and so we have fewer resources. So, yeah, absolutely, we need to once the overall pot of resources is variable, then we need to think, about the incentive effects of our policies, and that'll be true for both utilitarians and for prioritarians.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the question, the answer. Unfortunately, we have ran out of time. It's 1 o'clock. So I want to thank Professor Adler for your thought-provoking, insightful speech, and thank you everyone for attending. But before I let everyone go, can we all turn on our camera and take a picture together? And Kathy, please direct us.
Thank
you so much for joining. Please turn on the camera. I'll do some screenshots for everyone.
Hold on 1 second. I think that we need to unpin the move pin.
Okay. Yeah, from me, I can take screenshots. Just 1 minute. So please turn on the camera for everyone. Yeah, so say like a real picture. 1, 2, 3. 1. Okay, are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, start. 1, 2, 3. Just in case I do one more time. Yes. 1, 2, 3. All smiles. Very good. All done.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. So Our next session will be on October 13th by Professor Michelle Christian to talk about critical race theory of global color blindness. And again, it's very nice to see you all. Thank you again for Professor Matthew Adler for delivering the speech. And I look forward to seeing all of you at our next event. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Simon.
Thank
Thanks.
you for being here.
Thank you.
Bye.